we talked about the plus sides of owning such a vehicle, SUV or crossover, but what are some things you're losing in this pursuit of a off-road lifestyle or commanding position on the road and all the things that we discussed? What's something that we're losing out on?
The big pieces and what has driven consumers' acceptance of SUVs has always been fuel, right, and fuel economy. Whenever there's an energy crisis, there's definitely more sales of compact cars versus bigger trucks and SUVs. Right. And then, so I think that's the biggest trade-off in any way. You have fuel economy to think about, and SUVs aren't always fuel efficient. Although there's the argument that they are getting there now. Right. And with modern engine technology and chassis design, where they're really sharing platforms with small cars or hatchbacks or sedans. So, and with improved dynamics and improved aerodynamics, they are getting there. I would say that's still the biggest trade-off. Over a year you might spend maybe $1,000 more on gas if you're driving an SUV versus a sedan. But that's an overstatement. I would totally agree that's an overstatement. But at the same time, now there's a bit more normalization of hybridization and electricity, or as the major power that moves the car. Right. People are more prone to buying a hybrid SUV now than a regular SUV, which wasn't quite the case 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah. There's a lot more knowledge about even plug-in hybrids, not just regular hybrids. So that's, even though fuel economy is a big trade-off, with hybrids getting more popular and potentially even electric cars getting more popular in the next 5 years or so, it's definitely tipping the scales in the SUV's favor.
Right, so one thing that you've mentioned now is the fuel economy and how plug-in hybrids and hybrid vehicles are alleviating that concern. Another concern is about perceived safety versus actual safety. Is a crossover and an SUV really as safe as people think they are because of its larger size?
It's a very nuanced argument, and I'm going to try and get into it layer by layer. The first piece is, are you safe inside the car, right? And let's say you get into a collision when you're driving in an SUV with someone who's driving in a sedan. I'm not really sure how, from a percentage standpoint, how much more safe you are compared to the guy in the sedan. But you could argue that you're in a bigger car with a lot more metal around you, a lot more structural integrity around you. So you are slightly better off. But with the way modern cars are designed, with crumple zones and all sorts of advanced engineering going in there, you have composites in there, aluminum in there, all sorts of new technologies that bond these materials together. Most modern cars, you could say, are reasonably safe enough. Like, you see all these crashes of Lamborghinis where the car splits into 3 pieces, but the occupant cabin is completely untouched, and people just walk out of these crashes. That's how advanced structural integrity has become with respect to cars.
Okay. That
said, you could definitely have the concern about rolling crashes. So far we've been talking about head-on. When you start talking about rollover crashes, SUVs have traditionally had a bit more tendency to roll when you're doing, say, a high-speed maneuver. Traveling at 80 miles an hour on the freeway, let's say you're in New England and a moose comes onto the highway. And there's all these European magazines that do these moose tests, basically trying to evade an animal that suddenly comes in front of you on the highway. And you see almost continuously that SUVs sort of underperform in that test. Right. Maybe they blow their tires out, or they don't quite roll over, and that goes back to the structural integrity piece. But So that's a trade-off, and it maybe really boils down to how are you reacting to a grave scenario.
Yeah.
And then you can also make, different arguments, which is maybe the subject of another debate, but you can say that a Tesla Model 3 or a Model S, which is a sedan, is probably safer than a Jeep Wrangler SUV in, your typical Encap testing, and we've seen that with the Wrangler scoring poorly in recent Encap testing. But that's a different argument. That's
And could you explain what Encap testing is?
Encap testing is this thing that is done in Europe. It's called so the acronym stands for New Car Assessment Program, and I think governments are behind it in terms of getting cars on the road. New cars have to go through that testing, get rated by the group that does the testing, and they basically put the car through all sorts of all sorts of torture. They crash it, T-bone the cars, they crash them head on, they roll them, all sorts of things. And they basically evaluate the structural integrity and occupant safety, basically give you ratings on how safe the occupants are. And they've been very instrumental in getting knee airbags and things like that in cars. But again, coming back to SUVs versus sedans, the bottom line or the short answer is you could be slightly more safe in some situations, but slightly more unsafe in some other situations. So it boils down to how you react to a situation where you're about to crash. What do you think?
I don't know much about crash test safety and those kinds of protocols, but I do feel like it gives you a perception of safety that may not actually be 100% of the way true, and it might lead to an overconfident driver, let's say. If you're in a really big SUV or even a crossover, you're slightly above everyone, and you're, let's say, in a regular situation on a highway, and it's snowing or there's a layer of ice or water on the highway, you might, as a driver, feel like you're in a bit more control of the situation compared to a sedan, while the reality may not be so.
You raise a very interesting point, and this has happened to me when another road trip, rental SUV. I felt very unsafe using the throttle and brake in that car just because I wasn't feeling how much momentum I was carrying, and it could totally be because I was new to driving an SUV, and I totally understand with more time you might get better with the impulses of how the car is behaving around you. But I actually stopped using the pedals, and that was the only trip when I used the cruise control a lot more than the pedals, because I wasn't trusting myself to stop the car, slow it down to a certain speed if I was behind someone, whereas trusting the automation or the cruise control to do that for me.
Right.
So the seat of the pants feel, I feel like that you could potentially miss. But again, modern SUVs have all sorts of suspension tricks that they do to still give you that, like you have magnetic suspension where you can use a toggle to put it in sport mode, and you're going to feel more of the road, put it in comfort and you feel like you're wafting along. So there's technology to kind of overcome that